recording? Okay. And so I'm going to start by acknowledging that this seminar today is being hosted from UWA, which is on the Wajak Bujar Noongar traditional land. And so I'd like to pay my respect to the Noongar elders, past and present, and to their emerging leaders as well. We are now nearing the end of our seminar series for semester 1 in archaeology at UWA. We have only one remaining seminar next week after this, and then we'll be back for semester 2, which starts at the end of July. And potentially it will be moved to the Thursday rather than a Friday, same time, 3 to 4. But watch this space because I'm still working on being able to do that. So we might just still being on the Friday. And to follow us and know all about these updates, we've got the Facebook and the Twitter, UW Archaeology pages, and then all of the events on the Eventbrite page as well, where you will also see that we've just recently put together a little lab analysis service hub here at UWA. So just a little bit of advertisement here. And so this is the talk for next week, which is going to be Alison Crowther talking from UQ about her new future fellowship project on specifically archaeobotany, but more generally the archaeology of the Austronesian expansion in the Indian Ocean. Just a little note that the talk is being recorded, so just bear that in mind at the end during the discussion, including in the chat or whatever you send or say. It's all being recorded, and it might be shared on YouTube at some point. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Hilary Howes from the ANU, specifically this week for the National Archaeology Week. And she's going to talk to us about aspects of her new DECRA research project starting in a few weeks officially. But at the moment, she's a research fellow in the Center for Heritage and Museum Studies at the Australian National University, working on Cressida Ford's ARC Discovery project, which is about heritage and reconciliation. And Hilary's research has been specifically looking at German-speaking traditions within anthropology and archaeology, focusing on Austrian, German, Russian, and Swiss collectors and collecting practices in Australia and the Pacific throughout the whole 19th century and around this period of time. So welcome, Hilary. Looking forward to your talk. I'm going to make sure that everybody is muted and the cameras are turned off during the talk, but then please, everybody, put on your cameras for the discussion at the end. So I'll stop sharing so that you can share.
Thank you, Emily. I'll share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good, great. And are you seeing the, you're not seeing the presenter?
No, we're only seeing the slides.
Great, just checking. Thanks very much, Emily. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're Paul Turnbull joining us from Vienna, or anybody else joining from other parts of the world. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, as well as to any First Nations people who may be in the audience today. And as Emily has mentioned, I'll be talking to you today about my DECRA project titled Skulls for the Tsar, Indigenous Human Remains in the Collections of Imperial Russia, which I think in the announcement for this seminar I had that it would commence in May. It's now commencing at the beginning of June, but it would have commenced at on the 31st of May, so really there's very little difference. And I will start by giving you some background information about myself and my involvement in provenance research and repatriation to date, followed by an overview of the project's hypothesis, its theories and research questions, and the ways in which I'm hoping it will contribute to important gaps in knowledge. I'll then take you through the benefits expected to result from the research, and I'll conclude with a look at the project design and implementation plan, as well as how I intend to communicate my findings. So giving you a bit of background information about myself, my DECRA project builds on my career engagement with repatriation, my scholarly research on the removal and return of ancestral remains, and my knowledge of 19th century Russian and German collectors and collecting. It aims to produce the first detailed investigation of the acquisition of Indigenous human remains from Australia, New Zealand, and the broader Pacific by Imperial Russia. And my scholarship in this area developed during my doctoral studies here at the ANU, and it expanded during my position as postdoctoral fellow within the ARC Laureate Fellowship Project, the Collective Biography of Archaeology in the Pacific, a Hidden History from 2015 to 2020, on which Emily was also a postdoctoral fellow. And in addition to my scholarly research and publications, I bring to the current project, or the almost current project, 3 years experience in a public service role based in the Australian Embassy in Berlin, with direct responsibility for facilitating the repatriation of Australian Indigenous ancestral remains from German institutions. Now, why is my slide not going forward? Sorry. There we go. That's annoying. 3 handover ceremonies were held during my employment at the embassy, including the first ever return of remains from Germany to Australia. A further 9 have since taken place, building partly upon the groundwork that I laid and protocols I developed. I've also contributed to provenance research directly. A report I compiled for the Department of Communications and the Arts in 2012 enabled 29 ancestral remains removed in the 1880s from Cape York and Torres Strait to be accurately provenanced and successfully returned to their traditional owners. And I have to say that involvement is possibly the most meaningful thing I have ever done with my research. Having witnessed at firsthand the deep emotional impact of these repatriations and their potential to facilitate healing and reinvigorate cultural identity, I'm committed to contributing further to provenance research leading to the repatriation of Indigenous ancestral remains, building on my strong policy background and demonstrated capacity to translate my research into this field for government. My skills as a linguist are essential to the DECRA project. They encompass near-native fluency in written and spoken German, close familiarity with historical German scripts, and good reading competence in Dutch, French, and Latin. Though Emily would confirm that I don't speak French at all well. I can say salade niçoise, and that's about it. German was the major language of 19th century science in continental Europe, and German language networks for the collecting and scientific study of human remains extended well beyond German borders. The Russian Empire and its Baltic governorates are a case in point, as I'll explain in more detail shortly. And the Baltic governorates were roughly equivalent to modern-day Estonia and Latvia. This is a map of the Russian Empire and its gradual expansion. You can see how absolutely enormous it was at its height. And the area to the left circled in red is roughly the area of the Baltic governorates. So Estonia, Latvia, roughly speaking. I am also familiar with the key German archives, which hold materials relevant to Russian collections. I've worked extensively in them for my doctoral and postdoctoral research, and I have been attempting to learn Russian for the past 2 years. I can already assess and analyse written materials, and I'm working on improving my speaking and listening skills. To maximise the effectiveness of planned research in Russian archives, I've allocated funds in my budget for a research assistant to accompany me to Russia. I hope. Some of these travel plans may need to be rethought in the light of COVID, but we shall see. To help with the efficient identification of relevant documents and information, navigate Russian archival systems, provide expert translations and analysis of key texts, interpret in meetings with Russian curators and scientists, and assist with relationship building to facilitate museum and archival access. Since 2015, I've collaborated closely with Professor Cressida Ford, the lead CI on 4 ARC projects of direct relevance to my DECRA, and they are Return, Reconcile, Renew, Understanding the History, Effects and Opportunities of Repatriation, and Building an Evidence Base for the Future. And the project team is generally referred to as the Return, Reconcile, Renew team, or the RRR team. Restoring Dignity, Networked Knowledge for Repatriation Communities, Profit and Loss, the Commercial Trade in Indigenous Human Remains, and Heritage and Reconciliation. These 4 projects benefit from a strong team, you see them here, or some of them, of key Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and repatriation practitioners in Australia, Austria, Germany, New Zealand, and the USA. The projects also have advisory group members additionally in Japan, South America, and the UK, all of whom are available to provide guidance on the DECRA. And I'm very grateful for that, because I don't think this project would be possible without their support. My own collaboration with the ARR team to date has included presenting 2 papers in the repatriation stream at the 8th World Archaeological Congress in Kyoto, contributing 3 chapters to the Routledge Companion to Indigenous Repatriation, which was published early last year, co-authoring comprehensive country reports on museum holdings, policies, and repatriation engagement in Germany and Russia, to be held in the ARR Digital Archive, and teaching into the ANU Masters and Professional Development course, Introduction to Repatriation, Principles, Practice and Policies. And this course will be running again as an intensive course, a short course from, I believe it's the 13th to the 17th of September this year, but you know, I would highly recommend it. I've completed it myself. I found it extremely beneficial, and there are not really very many courses comparable at this point in time, I don't think. So, you know, give it some thought. My collaborations with Dr. Jelena Govor, who may also be here, in which case, Privyet Eli Большое Spasiba, are central to my DECRA. And Dr. Govor is a native Russian speaker and an expert on Russian voyages of exploration to Australia and the South Pacific. We have co-authored 2 chapters on Russian collecting in the Pacific for the Routledge Companion to Indigenous Repatriation, as well as the country report on Russia for the ARR Digital Archive. And these 3 outputs serve as crucial scoping studies for the DECRA. I have also formed collegial relationships with investigators in the ARC Linkage project, reconstructing museum specimen data through the pathways of global commerce, and in the ongoing correspondence of Ferdinand von Müller project based at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria. And these broad networks, I think, will all assist the project's feasibility. Now, to give you an overview of the project, the idea is that it will interrogate the scientific networks of Imperial Russia, revealing hitherto unknown information about how they operated, the anthropological collections they generated, and the intellectual traditions in which they were embedded. It will use an innovative research methodology that draws on the history of science, object biography, collective or group biography, and a participatory action research model of consultation with affected Indigenous communities. The project will contribute to 3 important gaps in knowledge and 1 significant problem. So firstly, the history and contents of Russian museum collections are almost completely unknown. Almost nothing is known about Russian holdings of human remains for the purposes of anthropological investigation. This is partly due to language barriers and difficulties accessing Russian archives, partly because the potential of German language resources has been missed, and partly because of persistent assumptions of Anglophone preeminence in the history of the human sciences. I think it's important to point out that this gap in knowledge does not reflect a lack of primary source material, and it doesn't indicate that few Indigenous human remains from the regions considered by this project are to be found in Russian collections. My scoping studies with Dr. Govor identified 140 Indigenous human remains from Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, held in collections within the borders of the former Russian Empire. However, information about them is slight, with no provenance details yet available for any of the Aboriginal Australians whatsoever. This project will be the first to produce and provide affected Indigenous communities with detailed information about the locations from which remains held in Russian collections were taken, the circumstances of their removal, and the people and institutions involved. This is an essential step towards Indigenous communities commencing dialogue on repatriation with Russian institutions. It's thus a significant contribution to repatriation practice. The Australian government recognises the contribution of repatriation to healing and Indigenous wellbeing, and its national science and research priorities include research leading to better health outcomes for Indigenous people. Secondly, little is known about the key Russian intellectual figures involved in the study of Indigenous remains, or about the extent and nature of their collecting networks. This deficiency severely limits our understanding of communities of collectors in Imperial Russia, and how the networks in which they were situated were made, used and maintained. My scoping studies with Dr. Gavor identified key figures whose involvement in transnational collecting networks urgently requires further research. And here you see some of them. Adam from Krusenstern, leader of the first Russian round the world expedition in 1803-06. Fabian von Bellingshausen, whose 1820 visit to New Zealand's South Island was the subject of a recent Maori documentary titled The Russians Are Coming. And that is well worth a look. If the last time I checked it was still available online. And if you Google The Russians Are Coming, you should be able to find it. But it's really extremely well done and very interesting. And then to the right, you see Karl Ernst von Baer, who was curator of craniological collections at the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. More portraits in the, well, Rogues Gallery is a bit unfair, I suppose. Gallery of key figures. Anatoly Bogdanov, the founding member of the Imperial Society of Devotees of Natural Science in Moscow. Dmitry Anichin, Russia's first professor of anthropology. Ludwig Steder, professor of anatomy at the universities of Tartu and Kaliningrad. Back in the day, Tartu was Dorpat, and Kaliningrad was Königsberg, and I believe was part of East Prussia, but it is now a Russian enclave. The scoping studies also revealed numerous prominent German and German-Australian individuals involved in Russian-German networks of human remains collection and exchange, including the following: Rudolf Virchow, leading pathologist and cell biologist; Victorian government botanist Ferdinand von Müller, who, as far as I can make out, didn't have any interest in craniology or anatomy from a personal point of view, but was extremely active in using his network of collectors in Australia to obtain ancestral remains for contacts in Europe and Russia. And Dresden-based museum director A.B. Meyer. Now we've seen those two already. The significant problem is that a new method of writing about the acquisition of Indigenous ancestral remains is urgently needed. Writing the history of those who collected ancestral remains is necessary, but it's not sufficient on its own. The Russian collectors that you've just seen are named and partly known. I could find portraits of all of them on Wikimedia Commons, for example. But the Indigenous people whose bodies they sought to study are still anonymous. If historians are to avoid becoming complicit in the continued silencing of Indigenous histories, I think it's imperative that they find new ways of writing the post-mortem histories of those whose physical remains were the subject of removal and study. As well as seeking the return of remains, Indigenous communities have made it clear that they need to understand whose remains were taken, why they were taken, and what happened to them. These are all necessary steps towards enabling remains long treated as objects to become people again. This project will confront the challenge head on and explore new ways of writing a rehumanising history of Indigenous human remains in museum contexts, working closely with communities whose ancestors' remains are already known to be housed in Russian museum collections. And the fourth gap in knowledge is that Russian approaches to human diversity are poorly understood in Western academia. Existing scholarship on the history of collecting and use of Indigenous ancestral remains from Australia and New Zealand and the broader Pacific focuses largely on intellectual traditions in the West. The idea of my project is that it will shed a new and significant light on the history of the biological sciences in Russia and enable a better understanding of Russian perceptions of Indigenous peoples. It will clarify the extent to which Russian collectors and scholars of Indigenous human remains collaborated with or competed against collectors and scholars of other nations. In doing so, it will critically analyse the influence of Russian scientific thought and practice on the establishment, maintenance and use of museum collections which continue to perpetuate the dispossession of traditional owners. As I mentioned previously, in collaboration with affected communities, I'm hoping to innovate a new method of writing about the acquisition of Indigenous ancestral remains, which privileges Indigenous biography and experiences over histories of collectors and collecting. I'll talk about this in more detail shortly, but the project is also original in other respects. So I'm hoping that it will produce important new knowledge about key individuals, including those I've already mentioned, who were involved in the study of Indigenous remains in the Russian Empire, as well as about the scientific networks they deployed to advance their career trajectories. And I was quite surprised really looking into the life histories of some of those individuals, just how mobile they were, moving from positions in academia or museology in what's now Germany to what's now Estonia, what's now Latvia, what's now Russia, and back again. Some of them undertook extensive travel in the wider world as well. I mean, I think I hadn't anticipated it to quite that extent. But I think it's fair to say that existing scholarship on the key figures that I've identified largely neglects these topics. So specifically their study of Indigenous remains and their scientific networks. Mostly it focuses on their importance as pioneering theorists or their involvement in realising Russian naval ambitions. The only real exception to this lack of scholarly attention is the Russian traveller naturalist Nikolai McClure-McClay, whom you see here. And I am hoping to build on Dr. Gavor's groundbreaking research and the research of others to further illuminate McClure-McClay's contradictory views of Indigenous peoples, as well as his involvement and that of other key figures in transnational collecting networks. My project will also shed light on the nature and extent of differences between Russian and Western intellectual traditions in the biological science. Hanfa Moylan's recent monograph on the beginnings of ethnography and ethnology before Boas highlights important early thinkers on these topics in the German Enlightenment, many of them active within Russian scientific networks, but no equivalent work exists on parallel Russian traditions, making this project an essential and timely contribution to existing scholarship, I hope. Mogilna's important monograph, Homo Imperii, focuses on institutionalised Russian anthropology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which is a small subset of the longer time period and wider disciplinary fields I'm hoping to explore in my DECRA project. While on the one hand, the key figures that I identified earlier bridged the Russian-German nexus, the geopolitical situations of the two nations were distinctly different, and it's likely that their contrasting approaches to colonisation, exploration, missionary activity and trade influenced intellectual traditions in the biological sciences in different directions. And just as one example, Darwinist thought enjoyed great popularity in Russia in the 1860s and 70s, but encountered considerable scepticism in Germany at around the same period. I'm hoping to interrogate these differences and their flow-on effects for the collection and study of Indigenous human remains, complementing existing scholarship on the history of Russian anthropology and archaeology, as well as early intellectual links between Russia and Germany. And as I think I previously mentioned, German language resources are a highly significant avenue for investigating the networks underpinning Russian collections, but to date they've been largely neglected for this purpose. There has been a recent increase in scholarship to understand Germany's own colonial collecting activities, but the examination of German language scientific networks beyond German borders was almost non-existent. But Russian-German networks in biology, ethnography, natural history and physical anthropology were strong and numerous in the long 19th century, and they depended heavily on what are called Baltic Germans. These were descendants of Catholic traders and crusaders who settled in the eastern Baltic territories in the 12th and 13th centuries and established themselves as the social, commercial, political and cultural elite, with German as their official language of education and government. On the left, you can see Russia's Baltic governorates, which roughly correspond to present-day Estonia and Latvia. And on the right, you can see just how closely they were located to, particularly St. Petersburg. And on the other hand, I'll show you another map shortly, when Poland was considerably smaller than it is now. Russia's imperial territories actually shared a border with Eastern Prussia, and so there was sort of an easy avenue, I suppose, really, geographically speaking, and also an obvious connection through the German-speaking populations of both areas. Many key figures in the history of Russian maritime exploration and the development of biological sciences in Russia were Baltic Germans who bridged the gap between Russia and the German-speaking lands. That includes Karl Ernst von Baer, Fabian von Bellingshausen, Adam von Krusenstern, and Ludwig Steder. And I suspect more such figures will become apparent as I continue further research. Works by Barrett, Cavor, and others have contributed greatly to our knowledge of early Russian voyages to Australia and the Pacific, but this will be the first project to focus on Imperial Russia's acquisitions of human remains from Australia and the Pacific. Now, the project's research questions essentially, oh, this was the map I was going to show you, sorry. So if you look at the pale blue area, that's the Kingdom of Prussia, around 1815. And you can see that it extends all the way up through Königsberg, which is now Kaliningrad, right up to sharing a border with the Governorate of Courland, which is present day, get this right, Latvia, I believe, but was then part of the Russian Empire. So, and the Russian Empire also shared a border with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So really there were two avenues for German speakers to sort of cross borders, I suppose, directly. Yes, the research questions. They flow from the significant problems I've already outlined. So which museum collections within the borders of the former Russian Empire, including countries that are no longer part of Russia, so Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which museum collections within the borders of the former Russian Empire currently hold human remains? How many do they hold? From which communities and countries were these remains removed? What were the circumstances of their removal? Secondly, who were the key Russian intellectual figures involved in the collection and study of Indigenous remains? What was the nature and extent of their transnational collecting networks? How were these networks made, used, and maintained? Thirdly, how can historians and affected communities collaborate to write about the acquisition of Indigenous ancestral remains without silencing Indigenous histories? And fourthly, were Russian perceptions of Indigenous peoples and Russian intellectual traditions in the biological sciences similar to those documented for the West? Or were there unique aspects that will alter our understanding of the role of science in colonisation and dispossession? And I don't know the answers to all these questions, but I'm hoping I will find them out or begin to find them out in the course of this project. I'll talk a little bit now about the project design and implementation plan, and the key figures that I introduced you to earlier, will form the springboard for this project. Immersion in their life histories and close reading of their publications will enable me to map their collecting activities, their institutional affiliations, intellectual influences and personal relationships, revealing further individuals and institutions of interest. I've already applied this approach successfully in previous publications and provenance reports dealing with German-speaking scientists. The wholly or partly German language scientific journals detailed on this slide are significant primary sources for this project and will be scoured for additional information about actors in Russian-German physical anthropology and biological science networks. From previous experience, such publications often included studies of human remains from multiple collections, as well as references to donations, exchanges, or purchases of remains from various sources. I'll focus especially on evidence of museum exchanges as a manifestation of relationships between individuals and institutions in Russia, Germany, Australia, and New Zealand. I will seek primary source material and/or perhaps look at employing research assistants on the ground to seek primary source material, particularly on Russian collectors or those acquiring remains on their behalf, in the libraries and archival collections detailed on this slide, among others. In addition, I will extensively consult digitised resources such as newspaper reporting of Russian activity in Trove and Papers Past, as well as digitised archival collections such as that of Ferdinand von Müller, who was an extremely prolific correspondent And the team at the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria has put in an absolutely enormous amount of work locating his letters in overseas archives, because there isn't an archive of letters that he received. I believe it was destroyed or lost shortly after his death, but there are many, many letters that he sent to colleagues in archives across the world. So that's a really important source of information. In parallel with archival and library research, my project will adopt a participatory action research model of consultation with affected Indigenous communities. I'm keenly aware of the need for researchers who work with, alongside and for Indigenous communities to undertake research ethically and be receptive to community questions and priorities, skills and sensitivities, as articulated by Linda Tuiwai-Smith and others. There is clear evidence that remains from the Torres Strait and from the Nelson area of New Zealand entered Russian collections during the 19th century. Mr. Ned David, Chair of Goora Cod Torres Strait Sea and Land Council, the Peak Organisation for Repatriation Matters in Torres Strait, and Dr. Amber Aranui, Repatriation Researcher at the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa, fully support my project, thank you both, and will assist in community consultations in Torres Strait and New Zealand respectively. Through annual face-to-face consultations and quarterly teleconferences with affected communities in these two areas, I will establish a scholarly and community research feedback loop, sharing my findings with communities, taking on board their advice, expertise and requests, and adapting my research strategy and response. In developing a new historiography for the removal and study of Indigenous human remains, my project will explore whether and how historical biography may be used where rigorous research identifies known or named individuals. Most Indigenous human remains in museum contexts are anonymous, but a few pioneering historical biographies of exceptional cases have been published in recent years, and The Hanged Man and the Body Thief, which you see on the left, is one very fine example of such an exceptional case. I will also explore whether and how histories can be told through the relationships of ancestral remains with their communities of origin, an approach successfully adopted in Martin Thomas and Beatrice Bijon's acclaimed documentary film, Etched in Bone. Much of the film is set in Arnhem Land, where senior elders use ritual and ceremony to restore the spirits of stolen ancestors to country. In addition, my project will examine the potential of the object biography/itinerary approach for writing new types of histories about Indigenous human remains, which were not objects but were mistreated as such in museum contexts. Object biography/itinerary acknowledges that objects have the capability of accumulating histories and seeks to document the cycles of production, exchange, and consumption in which they are entangled over time. I intend to push the boundaries of object biography/itinerary further to make it suitable for studying the post-mortem histories of Indigenous ancestral remains. Finally, I will draw on Thomas Lecoeur's approach in his seminal cultural history of mortal remains, The Work of the Dead, interrogating whether and how anonymised human remains in museum contexts are able to perform cultural work by creating a community of memory that unifies the living. In writing about the key Russian intellectual figures involved in the study of Indigenous remains, I will apply the collective or group biography approach pioneered in the field of historiography of Australian science by Tom Griffiths, and further developed in relation to the broader Pacific by Matthew Spriggs and colleagues, including both myself and Emily. It is well suited to a study of intellectual traditions and collecting networks, leaving room for complexity and contingency, revealing influential intergenerational patterns and influences, and avoiding the artificial isolation which inevitably accompanies an intense focus on a single individual. Turning now to the potential benefits of this project, it will illuminate under-researched aspects of the history of collecting and collections, Indigenous history, and the history of science. Language barriers and assumptions of Anglophone preeminence in the history of the human sciences have left Russian approaches to human diversity poorly understood. Yet it is arguably more urgent than ever to make sense of the historical contributions of physical anthropology to shaping relations of the biological and the cultural in the understanding of human behaviour. Belief in a relationship between race and intelligence persists, unfortunately. Ancient DNA research is being used to make sweeping claims about human prehistory, and recreational DNA ancestry testing is booming with attendant risks of reifying both racial difference and the epistemic authority of science. The project has strong potential cultural benefits for Indigenous communities seeking the return of their ancestors from Russian collections. Indigenous peoples in Australia and New Zealand have been campaigning for the return of remains since the 1960s, with growing success. However, without the type of detailed provenance information this project aims to produce, it is impossible for Indigenous communities to submit repatriation claims to Russian institutions. The next users of my research are the community members, repatriation researchers and practitioners who are responsible for making repatriation claims on behalf of their own communities and others. This project will work closely with two affected communities in Torres Strait and the Nelson area of New Zealand, and with those responsible for making repatriation claims on their behalf, Ned David and Amber Adenui. I anticipate that these individuals will use my findings to submit repatriation claims to Russian institutions. If successful, these claims would benefit the wider communities to whom ancestors are returned. My research will also clarify why remains were removed and how they were subsequently used, questions of great significance to affected Indigenous communities. I will provide results to the Torres Strait and New Zealand communities directly and will seek their involvement in writing rehumanising histories of Indigenous human remains. This collaborative approach will have anticipated additional benefits of capacity building in Indigenous research. Understanding Russia's imperial past is also important for Indigenous peoples beyond Australia and New Zealand. The scoping studies identified human remains from Hawaii and Japan in Russian collections. Indigenous peoples of both nations are actively seeking to secure the remains of ancestors for appropriate reburial. Through my existing collaborations with the RRR team, I'm in contact with leading repatriation practitioners and researchers from these communities. Mr. Edward Halealoha Ayau, founding director of Hawaiian repatriation organisation Hui Malamai na Kupuna o Hawaii Nei, and Professor Hirofumi Kato at the Centre for Ainu and Indigenous Studies of Hokkaido University. Both fully support this project and have agreed to join its advisory group, and again, I'm very grateful for that support. In the longer term, I anticipate that museums in Russia will use my findings when assessing repatriation claims. Russian museums have so far been resolutely opposed to repatriation, but there are precedents for change. Museums in Australia, New Zealand and the UK resisted repatriation requests for decades before a large-scale change in attitudes became evident. German institutions have pivoted from mass resistance to mass support since 2005, and that really has been a change of astonishing speed from my point of view at least. There are already hopeful signs in Russia. In 2016, years of community agitation and political negotiation led to the only known repatriation of ancestral remains from a Russian institution to date, the return of the skull of Kazakh national hero Keiki Batet. Affected Indigenous communities worldwide have demonstrated extraordinary perseverance in the face of continued opposition and are their own best advocates for the repatriation of their ancestors and cultural heritage. This project will equip them with the detailed provenance information they need to enter into conversation with Russian museums. In parallel, I will commence relationship building with Russian museums and archives from year one, drawing on Dr. Gavor's pre-existing network of Russian scholarly contacts. I'll give you a little bit of an idea of the project's timeline, although as I think I mentioned, some of this may well change, particularly in light of COVID and corresponding travel restrictions. But this Gantt chart at least gives you a bit of an idea. And I don't think I need to tell you about the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies offering a supportive, high quality collaborative research environment. I mean, it does, but you probably know that already. I would like to mention that I'm hoping to build on my existing connections to German museum professionals and repatriation scholars through the German-Australian Repatriation Research Network, of which I'm a member. That includes the expertise of advisory group member Professor Paul Turnbull, who is very kindly attending this seminar. And he's currently investigating German language networks in Austria and the Czech Republic. I also intend to build on my successful collaboration to date with Dr. Gavor. Her Russian language skills, demonstrated expertise on Russian voyages of exploration to Australia and the Pacific, extensive experience in Russian archives, and existing relationships with Russian collecting institutions make her the ideal candidate for the research assistant tasks that I described earlier. And I'm also hoping to build on the RRR team's collaborations with the National Museum of Australia, which is a leading institution on repatriation practice and holds in care poorly provenanced ancestral remains and those that cannot yet be returned to country. In terms of communicating my results, just winding up, my plan is that the key project output will be a book aimed at a general readership, offering the first detailed investigation of the acquisition of Indigenous human remains from Australia, New Zealand and the broader Pacific by the Russian Empire during the long 19th century. This is a history that has scarcely been written about before and has certainly not been accessible to non-Russian audiences. It will also be written in a new way, informed by and ideally in co-authorship with those whose ancestors' remains were taken. Its structure will depend on the results of community consultations, but at this point I'm envisaging that it will take a broadly chronological but thematic approach, with chapters considering, for example, new methods of history writing, new histories about the people whose physical remains were removed and studied, and the development of major collecting expeditions and institutional collections, as well as chapters analysing the individuals and networks involved. I'm also planning to produce at least 3 articles in leading academic journals to explore broader theoretical issues, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to co-author an article in Russian with Dr. Gavor for placement in a leading Russian academic journal, raising awareness of the history and importance of repatriation amongst Russian scholars and contributing to international debate around repatriation policy, museum practice and protocols. I've mentioned that I will provide project results to the Torres Strait and New Zealand communities directly through annual consultations, quarterly teleconferences and accompanying research reports. Where appropriate, I will also disseminate results of public lectures like this one, conferences and online, and I hope to include general information about individuals and institutions involved in Russian-German collecting networks in the public-facing area of the RRR Digital Archive, which you see here, to raise awareness of the history and importance of repatriation and to assist repatriation practitioners and researchers. That's really all I wanted to say at this point in time, but I will be very grateful for any questions or any feedback. So thank you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Hilary. It's really exciting and necessary project. So it was really great to hear about your plans and the background and everything. Is there a burning question coming from the audience? Because otherwise I can start with mine.
Can I just say, hi Ellie, hi Andreas, hi Paul. Hi Guillaume, hi, it's really nice to see. Hi India. This is so nice. People I know. Hi, Amanda. Sorry, I'm over it now, but that's, you know, I really appreciate people coming. I think Sven has put a question in the. Oh no, hi Hilary. Hi Sven. Sorry, it's just so nice to, you know, see some real people.
Yeah. So everybody, you can put your cameras back if you have one, or if you're actually visible. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask you from my ignorant perspective, if you can, it's a very large question, so if you can summarize, what's the historical background in terms of the interest of Russia into the Pacific and Australia at this period of time?
Oh, I mean, I think Ellie would probably be able to answer that much better than I can, but I guess there are a range of reasons, really. I mean, partly it's easy to forget that the Russian Empire actually bordered on the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, from Vladivostok, there's immediate access to the northwestern Pacific. And so, of course, there's an interest, you know, and then there's a territorial interest. There's diplomatic consideration. I mean, the first Russian round the world expedition, which Ellie has written about, was set up with a range of purposes. It was partly interested in scientific collecting. Hi, India. Interested in diplomacy, particularly. I believe there was an embassy on board the ship that was intended to make diplomatic overtures to Japan. I'm not sure off the top of my head to what extent that was actually possible, but that was the intention. And there were trading interests as well, so finding new trading partners, new sources of material, trading and connected commercial interests. So, I mean, really, I suppose the reasons are similar to the reasons for Western European exploration of the Pacific, and those are just as multifaceted. And I probably haven't done them justice, but does that sort of begin to answer your...
Yeah, no, because I thought it was important to try to place that in the larger political economic context as well.
Oh, absolutely, and it's something I'll need to do once I actually commence this. But at this stage, I'm just having the worst time trying to fix in my mind exactly where the borders of any of the empires were at any particular point in time, and what they correspond to now, and not mixing up Latvia and Lithuania, which would be very offensive to anyone who lives in either of those countries now. But I mean, it must have been awful to live in. It must have been very difficult, I think, to live in a country like present day Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, the Czech Republic, where you just had someone marching through every other week pretty much, and planting a flag or something and declaring that now it was their territory. It just certainly this kind of a project makes you realize just how dynamic European history was.
Yeah.
Or makes me realize anyway.
I can see a question from Sven in the chat. So he's asking about any indication of a trade in human remains. If Australian repositories may have traded for Russian or European human remains.
Not directly at this stage, but I think it's very possible. So I believe Ellie is aware of a case of the West Australian Museum exchanging cultural objects from Australia for cultural objects from Russia. And I think that kind of avenue is very likely to have been used for human remains as well. But I just haven't found any specific examples of it yet. And there was certainly trading going on between, now let me see, what was the example? Well, Ludwig Steeder, for example, who was one of the figures I mentioned, was exchanging human remains from various ethnic groups in the Russian Empire for human remains from other parts of the world with German institutions. So, he had access to Russian collections, and that sort of gave him leverage because these were quite valuable remains in some cases. I mean, in the sense of difficult to get hold of, wanted in collections. And then you also have, for example, one of the A.B. Meyer, the Dresden-based museum director, is known to have exchanged quite a number of ancestral remains from New Britain, I think, off the top of my head, and possibly also New Guinea with one of the Russian institutions. And they were in his collection. I don't think he acquired them personally, but you get this sort of exchange of what people consider to be duplicates in their collection for something that they don't already have.
Sorry, there's also another question. They're all coming up in the chat. You can also just raise your hand and open your microphone if you want, but I'll read Guillaume's question, so he's asking if, based on your previous research and your research with Elena's, do you already see Russian theories or hypotheses on the origins and migration of Pacific Islanders that could be similar or completely different to the French, American, Anglo-Saxon, in terms of the west to east versus, American context, etc.?
That's a very interesting question, and one that I'm not really equipped to answer very well at this particular point in time. I mean, I think probably one should point out that theories on that topic within Western Europe and America were quite diverse in themselves.
Yeah.
But I mean, really, Ellie and I and Michelle Richards co-authored a paper on early archaeological field practices in the Pacific, and I think we found that Nikolai McLuhan-Mackay was largely taking the approach kind of, well, what would you say, like a bit of a smorgasbord. So some of the British approaches to archaeological practice, I mean, this is more to do with practice than theories, but was drawing from British theories and methodologies, but also from German theories and methodologies, and also some of his own ideas. So I suppose in that, perhaps one might expect to find a similar pattern in some of the theories about occupation or settlement of the Pacific, but I don't really know. I'll be very interested to find out.
Because it looks like there was a lot of multilingual skills, like
yes.
They could read a lot of the French and English publications.
Yes.
I don't think the other way around was that true, though. I don't
No.
think people could read the Russian ones. But
No.
that means that, yes, there was quite a lot of movement of ideas.
Yes, it's very interesting. I find, Bronwyn Douglas, whom some of you will know, and Ellie and I are hoping to do some work on connections between Russian and French and German scholars in the early mapping of the Pacific. And I mean, that's partly because we found that there are definitely strong connections between Russian and German scholars, strong connections between Russian and French scholars, at least in a slightly later period. Some between the German and French scholars, but in terms of the sort of three-way connection, we're not quite so sure how it sort of developed or what shape it took. So, you know, but so, I mean, it's quite remarkable how multilingual some of these people were, really. I mean, it sort of makes me a bit embarrassed about my feeble attempts to learn Russian.
Well, you're mostly multilingual, though. But I see there's a hand raised from Paul Arish. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for the talk, Hilary, and I think it's a fantastic project. I'm a historian and archaeologist based in Sydney. I've been aware of the Russian voyages there for a long time, since Glyn Barrett's work and also Inna's. And as an archaeologist, I've been privileged to be participating in repatriation ceremonies with the La Perouse community here. And I just think the work that you and others are doing in that space with overseas collections is fantastic. You know, it's really amazing work and has a great impact.
Thank you.
I'm currently just started as a researcher with an ARC project with the ANU and British museums about Aboriginal objects in those collections, not human remains, but other objects. So I'm very interested in tracing the pathways of objects there, but also we're quickly finding out about these other places where objects have ended up. And I'm just interested, I guess, in what records, like if you see those kind of two kind of collections, human remains versus other objects, they obviously are all considered to be objects in the minds of collectors, but whether there are different pathways there and different sort of records that you'll be chasing to try and find those, or if you expect to see records of objects as well in your research going into Russian institutions.
I would probably, I mean, it's a good question, thank you. I would probably expect to see more, I mean, perhaps a bit of both, but more records of objects and human remains entering the same collections, because quite often, the major collections like the Kunstkamera, the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography in St. Petersburg, is a sort of a museum of everything. So they're interested in everything. They're interested in natural history, they're interested in cultural artifacts, and they're interested in human remains. So there's really not a distinction made in that sense. And the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, which was sending out expeditions to collect for the Kunstkamera, was sending them out to collect everything pretty much across the board. I think largely the same would apply to the Museum of Anthropology at Moscow State University, because the society that established it was the Society of Devotees of Natural Science. So again, they really have a really broad sort of purview in terms of what they're interested in. I mean, there are some collections in parts of Russia that really, at this stage, I know very little about. Well, or other parts of, I'm quite interested in the university anatomical collection in what is now Tartu, but was then Dorpat, which was one of the sort of a major German-speaking university at the time. And that was an anatomical collection. So in that case, I would probably be expecting to see, and I would probably not be expecting to see cultural objects following those pathways, because Ludwig Steeder, who was, you know, had a guiding hand in building up the collection, I don't think was very interested in ethnography in that sense. So I suppose perhaps that might be one of the distinctions that I would expect to see. But again, you know, it's entirely possible I'll be surprised.
Yeah, thank you.
John, I've seen you. I just want to read the comment that Vanessa sent a while ago. She was saying that she's reading Sheila Fitzpatrick's book on Soviet migration to Australia. And so that was about these changing national and empire boundaries. And she said that it also created very tricky challenges for the person who wrote this book, as well as transliteration of Russian Polish names and so on, and how people change their identities during migration. So that's another layer, I guess.
I'm glad it's not just me who finds it challenging. I mean, even some of the, you know, so Krusenstern's name is spelt differently in Russian. Bellinghausen's name is spelt differently in Russian. Quite often the first names are variants of the German form of the name, but they're not identical. So, you know, it can be quite easy to think you might be reading about a different person, but actually it is the same. Or you have this situation that Ellie and I came across, where you have two people publishing on very similar topics, one of whom has the surname Alexeyev and one of whom has the surname Alexeyeva. It turned out they were married, they were husband and wife. But, you know, I mean, it becomes very, very complicated when you're trying to cite them and making sure you didn't put in the A where it wasn't meant to be.
Yeah, because actually I can see India nodding, but that's also an issue with what we're doing in terms of identifying the women who worked with archaeologists and all this name change, etc. But I can see John has been waiting with his hand raised. So would you like to ask a question?
Oh, thanks a lot. Great presentation. And I think it's a very vital piece of research, because as a museum director, retired now, of course, we've been aware that there's been a kind of quite a slip towards finding out about collections. And I'm talking not just simply about skeletal materials, but also about other cultural materials. And the bias has been very much towards the Western world. And in particular, at least initially, because of language issues, it's been focused pretty much on the Commonwealth countries with their different kind of colonial experiences. But I think it is really important research, and I think a lot will come out of it. It's strange that you mentioned today about the issue of names and things like that, because in fact, I've just been doing some family history of my own. And yesterday I was pouring through guides, because it's not just people's names that have changed, but with all the changes in Europe, the place names have changed.
Oh,
and
yes.
Sometimes they've changed 3 or 4 or 5 times, like that comment you made of people trundling across the landscape planting flags. It's very difficult, and it's going to be very hard for you to plot a clear course that readers of your reports are actually going to be able to figure out what's going to happen. So you may need some sort of glossary to remind people of the process of colonization within Europe as well as out of Europe. I haven't got much to comment on. I think it's, except to say, I think it's a really great project, and I'm glad that you're doing it, and you've got a good team around. And as a Kiwi, I appreciate that. And also as a museum director. There's just one quick thing just to check that you know that Nick Peterson wrote a fascinating paper about the influence of German anthropology on Australian anthropology.
Ah, I am aware of his, the edited volume that came out, but this is an earlier paper?
I'm not sure.
I'll have to look
maybe the one that's in that edited volume. I can't really remember where it's from, but just check with him anyway.
Okay. I'll do that. Thank you.
It's quite fascinating, the different influences that have been here, and of course, originally from New Zealand. We grew up with stories about a lot of these European explorers with very foreign names that litter the landscape of New Zealand. and of course here in Australia as well.
Well, that's right, you know.
So I think it'll be a fascinating...
Strzelecki, or is it Streletsky, and Kosciuszko, or is it Kosciuszko?
Exactly. So good luck with the project.
Thank you.
Good presentation.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for all the supportive comments. I really appreciate it. I'm a bit sort of terrified, to be perfectly honest. You know, it just seems so ambitious, and I well, you know, I'll do the best I can.
It is a big project, but I think Russia is a big country. So
you're telling me.
So I think that just comes par for the course. Anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you. And hi Amber, hi Eve. I've only just seen you there. It's so nice you've joined.
Thank you. I think there's no more question or comment in the chat. Oh, Paul, yeah.
Look, thanks very much, Hilary. It's a long overdue, fascinating project, and I can't think of a better person to do it.
Gosh, thanks.
I guess one of the big questions, which I think myself, Andreas, and you would share, is this issue about how you kind of develop new ways of writing about the fate of remains in museum collections. I mean, would you care to kind of, I know it's very early days, but this is something I think that we kind of are really wrestling with, to try to move away from a fairly conventional approach to writing the history of these collections, but at the same time are mindful of the degree to which you have to be truthful to the facts as they are. You know, taking into account obviously that you know, obviously you're going to come at this from different cultural perspectives, but nonetheless there are kind of core issues as historians that we really need to anchor onto, because it's so essential for decolonization of historiography. But I'm just wondering, you know, what are your thoughts about how we proceed with this? I mean, have you kind of reflected on this to, you know?
I think the more I reflect on it, the more difficult it seems.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, if there's any kind of, you know, kind of senses that you have at the moment about what might be a fruitful way to go with this?
I think it will probably depend quite a lot on the community consultations, what comes out of those, and also whether I'm able to find out any more about any of the people whose remains were taken, because, you know, I mean, just occasionally it is possible to find significantly more information, in which case you can tell a completely different sort of story. But I'm not enormously hopeful that will be the case, I suppose. And it's very hard, you know. I mean, the sources are just so much against one under these circumstances. I mean, I think perhaps there is some merit in following more consistently the trajectory of what remains were used for once they were taken, because I mean, it took me quite some time to realise that this was something that was very important to traditional owners. You know, I think I just assumed that people wanted the remains of their ancestors back and that would be it. But no, I mean, they really, my impression was that traditional owners really wanted to know, well, where had they been, who had been handling them, who had been using them, what for, what sort of studies, you know, like as thinking about the ancestor remains as people, what had they experienced in all their long time away from country. And I guess, you know, I mean, that might be something that one could come at in a slightly roundabout way, in the sense of, you know, what's been published on these collections, or what hasn't been published, what was the sort of what transfers did they undergo? And in the case of these countries, you know, they were very frequently transferred to other institutions, to other countries. And that perhaps would at least be a little bit of a counterweight to just, you know, here's yet another white dude. No, you know, I mean, no offense to all the white dudes in the room, I'm white myself. But, you know, something slightly more approaching the perspective of the remains. know, what did they undergo? But I mean, I don't know how easy it's going to be to do that in any convincing way.
Yeah, it really just does depend on what you come across.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah,
and it might be different approaches for different remains or different approaches for different communities.
Yeah,
I can see Elena's hand. Yeah.
Maybe I just can add that I think besides the protocols, we need to listen to our heart. And today in the news, I just heard that archaeologists in Moscow found new mass graves in Kommunarka, where my grandfather was shot. And for me, it is very personal. He was shot in Stalin's time. And when I think about this mass grave where my grandfather is, I think I can associate it with indigenous remains. So in a way, this project can become for us discovery of our souls, not only protocols. And if we write in that key, we would be understood and accepted by indigenous community, because we are doing it with all our heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Большое спасибо.
I'm going to read the last question because we're a bit over time. There's a comment and question from Kiren Ruki, who says, Kia ora, Hilary. Thank you for your talk. I'm Maori and working at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and just wondering if you'd come across German paleontologist, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this name correctly, Fritz Nettling?
I've heard of him, yeah.
In terms of moving human remains from Tasmania.
Oh, no, not specifically, but again, I think it's not at all unlikely.
I've started looking into Nördling. So yeah, look, I'll just leave my email in the chat. We can. I've got some files, but it's early days yet.
Thank you, Paul. And I'll certainly, if the name comes up, I'll certainly contact you, Karen. Thank you for the question.
Great. So I'm going to have to close it here and say thank you, everybody, for also engaging in this nice discussion at the end. And thank you, Hilary, for doing us the honor of being the first people to whom you present your DECRA research.
Well,
really
you're doing me the
research.
honor of being the first people to listen to it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.